Welcome back everyone, History with Hilbert here, and today I'm going to be starting a new series called History Visualised. And for the first sort of season of this series, which I'll try to upload one episode every week, I'm going to be talking about the Anglo-Saxons. And basically I'm going to be going through some of the, essentially the geography and the shifts in power and sort of the dynamics during the Anglo-Saxon period in England and to sort of a lesser extent Great Britain. And to kickstart it today, I'm going to be talking about the Anglo-Saxon Invasion. Now, a quick note about the term invasion: you could also call this a migration because it was more of a long-term process that happened over hundreds of years rather than just the quick burst of an invasion of Germanic warriors from the continent to Great Britain. Now as well, if you're interested, I have another video about the Anglo-Saxons called Who Were the Anglo-Saxons, if you want a bit of background about them on the continent and how they came. Now the Romans leave Britain at some point in the early 5th century. And during this period, we call the people who were left behind the Romano Britons, because they were the descendants of the Celtic, and I'll use that term in quotation marks, people who lived there before the Romans got there, but they had assimilated with the Romans, so that's why we call them Romano Britons. And they faced several invasions from the Picts, who were a tribe who lived in what's now Scotland, who invaded from there, and the Irish from across the sea, as well as Germanic, probably Saxon raids along the coast to take slaves. There were already some Germanic peoples in Britain before the Great Migration, and a lot of these would have been Roman auxiliaries who stayed behind after the other Roman troops pulled out. For example, you've got a contingent of Frisian cavalry on Hadrian's Wall, and these might have been the people who sent message across the North Sea and said to their cousins back on the continent, the Romans have left, why don't you come over? Then we see that the tradition says that Hengist and Horsa, who were these two apparently Jutish leaders, that they were given the land of Kent, and this was because the British king Vortigern wanted to marry, I think it was Hengist's daughter, and the dowry price was the whole, county of Kent. Now it's important to remember that this story, we're not sure if this actually happened. This is the account given to us by Gildas, who was a British monk from about 100 years after this time. So we're not sure if this actually happened, but that's the traditional story. Even if the whole story with Vortigern was made up later, it would make sense that the first Anglo-Saxons would land in Kent, because this is closest to Frisia, which is probably where they would have embarked from Europe to get to England. And as time goes on, the Anglo-Saxon invaders, they capture more and more land from the Britons, and in fact in the north, probably helped by these Roman auxiliaries from Hadrian's Wall, who were also Germanic, they actually managed to carve out a kingdom in the north called Bernicia, and this was actually around the area of the castle, the modern-day castle Bamborough. Obviously the castle wouldn't have been there in this period, but it was a fortress, most likely a Celtic fortress that was captured, and the name of the guy who captured the Anglian invader was Ida the Flamebearer. And if you are interested in The Last Kingdom, this is also mentioned in The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell, who is related to him. He's obviously his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And Uhtred of Bebbanburg, that whole line traces back to this one guy, Ida the Flamebearer, who captured it. And Bamborough, or as the Anglo-Saxons called it in Old English, Bebbanburg, has a very interesting history, because they essentially captured this one fortress in the north, and they were surrounded by the Celtic people all around, and Ida the Flamebearer's sons had to keep it out of Celtic hands, and they were basically besieged for many, many decades before they actually managed to carve out a kingdom in the north that would later be called Bernicia. Now the Anglo-Saxons do still continue to capture more lands from the British, and the British continually lose more land to these invaders, and the Romano Britons are then pushed further and further inland. Now whether this is through force of numbers, although I'd say this is unlikely, because I don't think that the Anglo-Saxon invaders would have had more warriors than the Romano Britons. I think they would have more likely been better warriors, because remember the Anglo-Saxons, they'd been used by the Romans as auxiliaries, while the Romano Britons hadn't been fighting at all because the Romans had protected them, and now that the Romans were gone, they probably didn't know how to fight, and that's why they were so weak to Pictish invasion, for example, and Irish invasion. But the Anglo-Saxons, they were very rough, they were very tough guys, they were these big, huge hunks of men who would absolutely decimate, the smaller Romano British, who were just quite happy to live in their villas and eat wine and drink wine and eat grapes and things like that. And perhaps as well, it's more of a cultural shift that we see where I've put Anglo-Saxon, because genetic studies have shown that probably, they probably didn't wipe out everyone, every Celt in the region. They're probably intermingled, but it's more sort of who was in control that changed, and that's what I've shown on the map. And to this day, actually, the Welsh, they called England the Lost Land, or Lloegr, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the Welsh there, because their ancestors were driven out by the English Anglo-Saxons to what is now Wales. But if you think about it, before the Anglo-Saxons then, all of this area would have been British, as in Celtic British. The British monk Gildas recorded that there was actually a break in the invasion after the Anglo-Saxons were halted at Mons Badonicus, or Mount Badon, by a mysterious figure who we now associate with King Arthur. Now, the legend of King Arthur is very complicated, and I'm actually going to make quite a few dedicated videos on this once I get round to it. But he is seen as, originally at least, now he's sort of knights and castles and things, but that all came later. We start to see the King Arthur myth around this time with the Anglo-Saxon invasion. King Arthur is, Pendragon, he's Welsh. That's a Welsh name, so he's a Celt, and these invaders that he's fighting against are the Anglo-Saxons. And there is sort of a cult of King Arthur that you see all around, and in all the Celtic-y areas, so for example Cumbria in the north, in Wales, Cornwall, even in Brittany, which is sort of the Celtic area of France, we see place names are named after King Arthur, and there are legends to do with King Arthur all over the place, because it's a very Celtic thing. He's the hero who's going to reclaim the lost land from the Anglo-Saxons and defeat them. And the reason we first hear about this mysterious figure who we now associate with King Arthur is because Gildas was actually writing after this battle he describes at Mons Badonicus, because he says that this was such a crushing defeat for the Anglo-Saxons that there was a period of several decades of peace between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, although after his death the conquest continues, and essentially the Celts are pushed to the corners of Britain. So we have, obviously, in Wales there were still Celts, they were pushed there. Cornwall was still Celtic. Cumbria at this time was still Celtic, although later this would also be captured by the Northumbrians. And how has this impacted modern Britain today? Well, I'm speaking to you in English, and English actually comes from Anglish, which is obviously the language of the Angles, and that is a Germanic language rather than a Celtic Brythonic language, because if the Anglo-Saxons hadn't invaded and no one else had invaded, then I'd be right now speaking a language that would be much more like Welsh or Brittonic from Brittany in France than English, which is a completely different language from a completely different language group. England itself as well wouldn't exist without the Anglo-Saxon invasion, because England, like English, comes from Anglaland, which meant England in Old English, land of the Angles, because England was essentially a land of the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and some Frisians as well. And Scotland, in the northwest of Scotland, they still do speak a Celtic language, the Gaelic language, which probably came in through the Dalriatans of Ireland. But in the south of Scots, more close to the border, along the border with England, they still speak a different Germanic language called Scots. And Scots, although it's you could say it's very similar to modern English, you can definitely, recognize things. It's another descendant of Old English, and actually it shares a lot of characteristics with, for example, the Northumbrian dialect, which is a dialect that a lot of the older generation speak where I live in Northumberland in the northeast of England. So, for example, the word for child, in Scots you might say a wee bairn, which means a small child, and in Geordie or Northumbrian dialect in the northeast you might say, oh, he's just a bairn, which is he's just a kid. And actually in Frisian, in Western Frisian, which is one of the areas where some of the Anglo-Saxons might have come from and is the closest language to English which is still spoken, the word bairn also means a child. So it's interesting to see the comparison between the three there. The national identity of Scotland is more Celtic, but in actual fact in the south they are more Germanic still, so the Anglo-Saxons had an impact on Scotland as well. And remember, if the Anglo-Saxons hadn't have been there, then Scotland probably wouldn't have such a proud Celtic national identity, because there wouldn't be any reason to, because the English there wouldn't be any English, but the people who now live in England would also be Celtic. The Welsh and the Cornish as well, they managed to keep the Anglo-Saxons from capturing their land, and so they still speak their Celtic languages as well. So you obviously have Welsh in Wales, and Cornish, although it has died out, was a Celtic language, and it's being revived as we speak. No pun intended. Now as well, the Anglo-Saxons, or the Romano Britons rather, who fled Britain to northern France, they actually named the place Brittany, and that's why the sort of peninsula you have in the northwest of France is called Brittany, because it's named after the Romano Britons who fled there from the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Alright everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this first episode of History Visualised, the Anglo-Saxon Invasion. Please remember to tune in next week when I'll be talking about the early and the later Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. I really hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope you're going to tune in again next week for the next episode of the Anglo-Saxon History Visualised. Thanks very much for watching. I'm History with Hilbert. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.